A slap. One sound, like a gunshot, stopped time in a Georgia courtroom. A 16-year-old black honor student stood still, struck by a white officer in front of everyone. No flinch, no fear, just a stare. But when his father, a senior FBI inspector, walked in, everything changed. This isn't just a story, it's a reckoning. Like, share, and subscribe, because what happens next will shake the system from the inside out. At exactly 9:34 a.m., the slap shattered the courtroom like a thunderclap, ricocheting off the mahogany walls and slicing through the murmurs of procedural monotony. It wasn't just noise, it was violence given permission. Permission granted by a uniform and decades of unchallenged authority. And yet, in the moment that followed, as eyes snapped toward the boy at the defense table, Elijah Cross, age 16, did not recoil. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He didn't even blink. He simply stood. Elijah had been sitting quietly, wrists resting on the polished edge of the defense table, his charcoal gray suit too grown up for someone with algebra homework in his backpack. His expression had been unreadable as the bailiff, Deputy Marshal Troy Beckett, walked past him one final time, shoulders tense, lips pressed in a scowl, eyes scanning the gallery like it belonged to him. No one expected the slap. It came so fast, so violently, it felt almost rehearsed. But it wasn't. It was impulse, rage, habit. And it struck Elijah squarely across the left cheek. The crack of skin on skin didn't just still the courtroom, it rebuked the myth of neutrality. It tore the mask off civility and revealed the face of power, snarling and unashamed. For a full 5 seconds, nothing moved. Pens hovered above notepads. A juror's coffee stopped mid-sip. The judge paused in the middle of turning a page. Even the ceiling fan seemed to freeze, its blades arrested mid-spin. Elijah didn't move. His brown eyes, sharp and quiet, rose slowly to meet Beckett's. He didn't touch his face, though the mark was blooming. Raw, red, unmistakable. His silence was not compliance. It was calculation. Inside him, a storm churned. But outside he was still, so still it unsettled everyone watching. Across the room, a woman gasped. In the second row, an elderly black man whispered to his wife, "Did you see that? He didn't even flinch." The bailiff, perhaps shocked by his own action, stood frozen for a breath too long. Then, almost casually, he stepped back, as if daring someone, anyone, to question him. But no one did. Not the judge, who adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat without addressing the assault. Not the defense attorney, who flicked a glance at Elijah before looking down at his notes. Not even the prosecutor, who pressed her lips together but said nothing. The silence in that courtroom said everything. This is how it works. This is what happens when you challenge the order of things. Elijah had been charged with disrupting public order after organizing a peaceful student-led sit-in at a state building, an act born out of frustration when a beloved black teacher was suspended for teaching about redlining and racial wealth gaps. No windows were broken. No police were harmed. No threats made. Yet he had been detained, strip-searched, and hauled into court in front of local media like a criminal. Because he refused to be silent. Because he had asked too many questions. Because he had led too many. And now, for that, a white man in uniform had slapped him, in court, in front of everyone. Beckett stood just a few feet away, still breathing hard, one hand twitching slightly at his belt. His face bore no regret, only the tight, defensive stare of someone who knew he would be protected. His record, had anyone bothered to check it, showed 3 prior complaints of excessive control, all filed by young black men, and all quietly dismissed by internal review. To the county, Beckett was a loyal officer. To the system, he was invisible armor. To Elijah, he was just another name in a long line of hands raised against boys who look like him. But this time the silence didn't hold. A voice from the back row whispered harshly, "That boy didn't deserve that." Another followed, "Where's the judge?" And then the sound of a phone camera snapping open, followed by a flicker of red light blinking from the gallery. Someone had caught it. On video. Still, Elijah didn't move. His stillness became the center of the room, the eye of a social storm no one could ignore. His silence wasn't submission. It was strategy. Every movement, every breath, was controlled. And then the courtroom doors creaked. Heads turned. There, in the doorway, stood a tall, broad-shouldered man in a tailored navy coat, his presence carved from calm authority. He didn't rush forward or call out. He just stepped through the threshold and scanned the room like a surgeon reading a chart. His eyes landed on Beckett, then on the judge, and finally on Elijah. Solomon Cross. To most in that room, he was just another father, another black man in a courtroom trying to keep it together. But behind his sharp jawline and federal ID badge, tucked deep inside the sealed folders in Washington, D.C., Solomon was a senior FBI inspector. His presence was no accident. He hadn't come to make a scene. He had come to take note, to watch the ones who believed no one was watching. When Elijah saw him, he didn't smile, didn't blink, but his shoulders seemed to settle just slightly. A mutual understanding passed between them, wordless, firm. The room didn't know it yet, but the balance of power had just shifted. Beckett, now visibly uncertain, took a small step back. The judge shifted in his chair, and for the first time that morning, a different kind of silence took hold. Not the silence of complicity, but the silence before collapse. The courtroom, once a fortress of routine, had cracked open. And Elijah Cross, 16 years old, with a red handprint on his cheek and fire in his eyes, stood at the center of it all. Not just a defendant, not just a boy, but a fuse, lit in plain sight, waiting to ignite something far bigger than any of them were ready for. The slap was the beginning. The silence was the warning. The reckoning had just begun. The courtroom was still vibrating from the slap, an invisible ripple that hadn't left the air since it rang out across the polished floor and buried itself into every breath that followed. Even 10 minutes later, the atmosphere hadn't reset. It couldn't. The bailiff, Deputy Marshal Troy Beckett, had returned to his post with a rigid posture and darting eyes, as if bracing for impact. The judge had resumed proceedings, but his voice was thinner, like someone tiptoeing across glass. And Elijah Cross, 16 years old, cheek still burning red, hadn't moved an inch. Then, at exactly 9:47 a.m., the courtroom doors opened again, slowly, deliberately. What walked in wasn't a storm, but the stillness before one. He wore a dark slate wool coat, open to reveal a crisp white shirt, a navy tie pinned neat and narrow, polished shoes that echoed with precision. Solomon Cross, father of the boy with the red mark, a man estranged from his son for nearly 4 years, and, unbeknownst to nearly everyone in that room, a senior inspector in the FBI's Internal Conduct Division, stepped through the doors like a chess master, entering a game already 3 moves deep. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence was language, command. His every movement was controlled, measured not for show, but for impact. Solomon had learned a long time ago that silence wasn't absence, it was leverage. And now, in this fragile, post-slapped courtroom, he wielded that silence like a blade. A few heads turned, then more. The crowd, already on edge, shifted uneasily. Who was this man? His posture carried the gravity of authority, but not the type that begged for attention. He didn't scan the room. He looked straight at the man who had slapped his son. Straight at Beckett. Their eyes locked across the expanse of stained oak benches and tense air. Beckett's face didn't move, but his hands clenched slightly behind his back. There was a flicker, brief, involuntary, in the bailiff's stance. Recognition, or at least confusion. It was the look of someone who suddenly realized they might have picked a fight with someone whose name they probably should have known. Solomon stepped forward once, not rushing, not hesitating, just moving like he belonged in every space he entered. "Elijah Cross's guardian," he said calmly, when stopped by a security officer at the rail. His voice was even, controlled. Beneath it, you could hear something older than authority. You could hear history, of files reviewed, agents reprimanded, abuses documented and buried. Of corridors of power walked for decades, of masks worn and removed behind closed doors. The officer hesitated, then nodded, as if subconsciously registering the shift in the room's energy. Elijah didn't turn around. He didn't need to. He felt his father's presence the way a tree senses rain, without sight, but with certainty. They hadn't spoken in over a year. Not since Solomon's last reassignment. Not since Elijah decided to organize protests instead of write letters. But here he was. Not in uniform, not holding a badge, just standing. That was all Elijah needed. Back at the bench, Beckett exhaled through his nose. A trickle of sweat beaded at his temple. The man who had struck a child in full view of the public was beginning to understand he may have made a mistake, far larger than he could contain with court decorum. The judge cleared his throat again. We'll continue with testimony, unless there's an objection." Solomon didn't raise a hand. He didn't speak again. But his presence made an objection unnecessary. The entire room was now a witness, and that changed everything. A reporter in the second row leaned toward her photographer. "Get his name," she whispered. "Get his face." The energy was tilting. The narrative was shifting. What had once been a boy alone at a table was now something more dangerous. A boy with a father who watched for a living. A man who had been trained to expose liars and dismantle systems from the inside out. Solomon took his seat in the second row, one bench behind Elijah, never reaching out, never interrupting. But his gaze stayed fixed on Beckett the entire time. The courtroom, already brittle from shock, began to fracture. The weight of the moment wasn't just about the slap anymore. It was about what came next, and everyone in the room could feel the storm building in quiet, calculated increments. Deputy Marshal Beckett cleared his throat, adjusted his belt, stared straight ahead. But for the first time that morning, his movements weren't laced with entitlement. They were reactive, defensive. He knew nothing official had been said, but everything had changed. The uniform no longer protected him. The room no longer deferred to him. One man's silent arrival had stolen his authority out from under him. And Solomon? He did nothing, said nothing, just sat still with his spine straight and his shoulders square, like a sentinel watching from the edge of a collapsing fortress. It was not revenge that flickered in his expression, but readiness. He had waited a lifetime for this moment, not the slap, not the spectacle, but the exposure. the opportunity to finally drag into daylight what had always operated in shadow. The prosecutor began to speak, her voice a bit more measured now. The judge shuffled some notes. Elijah, his back still to his father, finally adjusted his seat, just slightly, his posture easing, not out of comfort, but out of clarity. He knew this wasn't over. In fact, it had only just begun. Solomon's arrival didn't end the trial. It fractured the illusion that had protected the officer, the system, the silence. And now, the question hanging over the room wasn't whether Elijah had disrupted public order. It was, what happens when the system strikes a boy, and his father carries a badge sharp enough to strike back, with the truth? The clock ticked past 9:55. Beckett's hands were sweating. Elijah's silence still held. And Solomon Cross waited, because when you know how the machine works from the inside, you don't scream. You dismantle, quietly, thoroughly, piece by piece. The silence after the slap had cracked the courtroom like a fault line. But the silence that came after Solomon Cross took his seat. That silence was different. It wasn't stunned or accidental. It was active, heavy with recognition. The kind of silence that draws lines, sorts the watchers from the witnesses. It lasted only a few seconds, maybe 20 at most, but within that space, something shifted. Elijah Cross still hadn't spoken. He hadn't turned, hadn't touched his cheek. But the courtroom, once content to watch him be humiliated in silence, had begun to stir, uncomfortably, irreversibly. You could feel it. The first murmurs didn't shout. They hissed under breath like kettle steam. That boy didn't even move! Did you see his father? He just looked at the officer. That's all he had to do. Cameras didn't flash, but phones were already buzzing. A local stringer for a regional blog quietly typed a headline into his notes app. Slapped in silence. Youth protester assaulted in courtroom. The story hadn't gone public yet, but it was already alive, bleeding out of the walls of the courtroom like smoke seeking air. And Elijah, 16, still and silent, was the center of it all. His silence was not compliance. It was consequence. And that terrified the people who had expected him to fold. Across the aisle, two teachers from Elijah's high school sat in stunned disbelief. He organized one protest, one of them whispered. Just one. No violence. And this is how they treat him? A woman in the front row, a retired city clerk, clenched her purse tighter. This is bigger than a slap, she murmured. This is control. Solomon Cross, seated just one row behind his son, was already watching it unfold with trained precision. His hands were folded in his lap, but his mind was moving like a metronome. He had seen this exact posture of silence before, not in courtrooms, but in interrogation rooms, internal hearings, corridors of federal buildings where power dressed up as procedure. And now, here it was again, thinly veiled and dangerously bold. He didn't need anyone to point him toward the rot. He could smell it. Beckett's file was already in motion. By noon that same day, Solomon had sent 3 discreet messages to colleagues at the FBI's Office of Internal Affairs. All of them marked flag priority. None of them mentioned Elijah by name. Solomon didn't want favors. He wanted process, clean, documented, unstoppable. He requested disciplinary records on Deputy Marshal Troy Beckett, including sealed complaints and informal debriefs. The moment Beckett had raised his hand to Elijah, he had stopped being a nameless bailiff. He had become evidence. That afternoon, while court recessed for lunch, Solomon didn't follow the crowd to the courthouse cafe. He stepped outside into the biting wind, pulled out a discreet satellite phone from his coat pocket, and made 2 calls. One to Chief Analyst Regina Marr, who handled behavior profiling in officer misconduct. The other to a tech specialist, who could run predictive cross-references between Beckett's name and suppression trends in courtroom surveillance logs. No mention of family, no emotion, just data. Because Solomon Cross didn't wage war with outrage, he waged it with proof. And inside, the courtroom had become a hive. Reporters whispered to interns, spectators returned from the hallway with questions instead of coffee. People began to understand what had been done, not just to Elijah, but in front of them. The violence had been public, but the shame, theirs, was private. Their silence had enabled it. By 2 p.m., someone leaked the incident to a local news desk. By 3, it was on social media. A 33-second clip, low quality, shaky, taken from the back row, began circulating online. You couldn't see the slap clearly, but you could hear it, and you could see Elijah Cross, not moving, not blinking, not breaking. The caption read, "He didn't fight. He didn't speak. He just stared." And that was enough to break them. The silence that once protected Beckett now indicted him. And the judge? Still hadn't addressed the assault. Still hadn't admonished the officer. The silence from the bench, once a pillar of authority, now rang like a coward's bell. It was too late to contain it. The inaction of officials, their procedural murmurs and sidelong glances, had become louder than any outburst could have been. And the public had noticed. Elijah sat through it all, like a mountain that refused erosion. He was used to being seen as a threat, too smart, too composed, too aware of how the world misreads black boys in moments of stillness. He had learned early. Sometimes the most powerful resistance is stillness that dares to be witnessed. And now, his silence had done what speeches could not. It had revealed the fear in those who claim control. And yet none of it was over. That evening, Solomon began pulling files on 2 other bailiffs who had served under Beckett in recent years. He noticed a pattern, courtroom incidents that were marked as resolved internally, a phrase he knew all too well. He compiled timestamps, logged incident codes, flagged anomaly reports. This wasn't just about Elijah. It was about a culture, a stitched-together shield of unchecked aggression and buried consequences. He wrote one line in his notes, "Injustice isn't about chaos, it's about what systems protect in silence." By the end of the week, 3 national media outlets had picked up the story. Beckett was placed on temporary administrative leave. Anonymous tips began flooding the courthouse complaint line. People who had been silent for years suddenly remembering their own encounters, their own humiliations at the hands of that same man. Judges who once brushed it aside found themselves named. The room had cracked, and now it was collapsing. But Elijah remained silent through it all. Not because he had nothing to say, but because the world had finally begun to listen without him needing to explain himself. His father had come not with rage, but with receipts. And the ones who had once stood above them now looked small, scrambling to rationalize a slap that could no longer be buried beneath courtroom decorum. The silence that had once condemned Elijah had now condemned them all. And it was only the beginning. It began with a hesitation. District Attorney Monica Graves sat in her office on the 4th floor of the Fulton County Courthouse, watching the now viral clip for the 3rd time that morning. 33 seconds, 1 slap, no words. But the silence, the stillness in that courtroom was louder than any confession she'd ever heard. She had spent nearly 20 years walking the line between justice and preservation, fighting what battles she could, shelving others under the weight of not yet. But something about the look in Elijah Cross's eyes after the slap, something about that boy's refusal to flinch, refused to let her stay quiet. It was 10:32 a.m. when she picked up the phone and made the call that would set the unraveling in motion. "I need the sealed files on Deputy Marshal Troy Beckett," she told the records clerk, her voice calm but precise. The pause on the other end was thick. "You mean those files?" "Yes," Monica said, "all of them." Within 2 hours, a thick folder landed on her desk, labeled with red tape, stamped closed by internal review, and buried beneath 6 years of dust. As she flipped through the first 10 pages, her jaw tightened. 3 excessive force complaints. 2 court observers who reported verbal threats. 1 teenage boy from 2019 who claimed Beckett shoved him against a courtroom wall and whispered, "You're lucky this ain't the street." None of it had seen sunlight. All of it had been dismissed for lack of corroborating evidence. But Monica saw the pattern. It wasn't just a string of misconduct, it was a system of burial. Each complaint was routed through the same judge. Each witness listed in cursory detail, never called to testify. And Beckett's name was always cleared with lightning speed, the resolution files stamped with the phrase she had come to resent most: handled administratively. For years, Monica had told herself that some fights required patience, that pushing too hard might end her tenure before she could do real good. But this wasn't politics. This was a boy getting struck in open court, and a courtroom choosing silence over decency. This was rot, and she wouldn't be complicit in rot. By 1 p.m., she had called for a private meeting with 2 senior staffers and assigned a review team to cross-reference past incident logs from courtroom security. Check every missing clip, every disabled camera, every skipped timestamp, she said. And don't ask me why. Just move. Meanwhile, Solomon Cross was orchestrating a different kind of exposure, from the inside. His reach within the FBI wasn't just seniority, it was leverage. He'd mentored 3 current analysts in the Bureau's Oversight Division. He'd trained 2 former inspectors now embedded in DOJ civil rights units. And when he called in those favors, he didn't ask for special treatment. He asked for facts. Run background metadata on courtroom surveillance files going back 5 years in this district, he instructed. I want gaps, glitches, unexplained omissions. The results came back within 24 hours. More than 40 sessions had lost footage, many during trials involving young Black or Latino defendants. Records showed timestamps ending seconds before physical altercations and picking up again after courtroom order had resumed. A technical coincidence, the official logs claimed, but Solomon had worked enough crime scenes to know a glitch that repeats is not a glitch. It's a cover. And now, Monica's internal review team was finding the same thing. In old case files, victims had been labeled unreliable without explanation. Judges had dismissed claims of abuse without investigating. Clerks had failed to log complaints altogether. What emerged wasn't just misconduct, it was a culture, an institutional instinct to protect uniforms over truth, to edit the story before it left the courthouse. Monica stared at one such case file late into the evening. Case 04877B. A 17-year-old named Deontay Harris had accused Beckett of pushing him into a bench during a tense sentencing hearing. The file was thin, no video, one witness who declined to elaborate, and a closing note that read, "Handled informally, no formal finding." Monica looked closer. The witness listed S. Graves, her own intern, from 8 years ago. That's when she knew. The system hadn't failed by accident. It was designed to fail on purpose. She picked up her phone and called Solomon. "I know what you're doing," she said. There was a beat of silence. Then Solomon's voice. "And? I want in." From that moment forward, the walls began to crack. Monica reopened 6 sealed complaints. She filed 3 internal motions, quietly, strategically, flagging prior misconduct by Beckett and requesting an ethics review of Judge Alton Reese, the magistrate who had dismissed nearly every complaint in the last decade. Solomon leaked data maps to investigative journalists, showing geographic patterns of complaint suppression. He provided encrypted summaries of altered body cam footage to 2 civil rights attorneys who had been waiting for a break in their own local police brutality cases. And the community? They were no longer just watching. Protesters began to gather outside the courthouse, not in rage, but in awareness. Signs read, "We see the silence." Elijah didn't flinch. Why did you? News anchors, once careful not to pick sides, started using the word assault in their reports. The sheriff's department issued a boilerplate statement, but by then, the public wasn't buying rehearsed apologies. Because the story had changed. It wasn't about one slap anymore. It was about why no one stopped it. It was about the judge who stayed silent, the officers who looked away, the clerks who shredded files, and the DA who, at long last, chose not to. When Monica held a press conference 3 days later, she didn't make excuses. She didn't spin. She stood at a podium, flanked by her staff, and said plainly, "We have uncovered a pattern of abuse, enabled by layers of silence and shielded by broken oversight. That stops now." Inside, Solomon watched the live stream. Elijah sat beside him, quiet, nodding slowly. No cheers, no smiles, just a recognition. The peeling had begun. And once the layers come off, there's no putting them back. The courtroom, once a space of ritual and repression, had transformed into something far more volatile. A battleground where silence no longer offered protection. Word had spread fast, by text, by live stream, by breathless retellings, whispered over fences and through diner booths. The hearing to review Deputy Marshal Troy Beckett's conduct was scheduled for a Tuesday morning at 9 o'clock, but by 7:30, the steps of the Fulton County Courthouse were already lined with teachers, students, elders, and journalists, some holding signs, others holding memories. Inside, the air was thick with anticipation, not of legal formalities, but of something closer to reckoning. The room filled beyond capacity. Folding chairs were hauled in. Extra bailiffs were posted along the walls, though their presence only drew sharper glances now. The walls themselves, beige and windowless, seemed to sweat under the weight of what was about to unfold. In the front row sat Elijah Cross, composed as ever, his cheek now healed but not forgotten. Beside him, Solomon Cross, still dressed in his quiet armor of tailored restraint, eyes scanning every movement like a strategist preparing for the next phase of exposure. The hearing began with the usual procedural theater. Introductions, agendas, case numbers read aloud like incantations meant to suppress emotion. But it was clear within minutes. This would be no ordinary proceeding. Too many eyes. Too many questions waiting to rise. Beckett sat stiff in his uniform, arms crossed over his chest. He hadn't spoken publicly since the slap, and he wouldn't today. His lawyer made that clear. But posture is a language, and Beckett's was one of bruised entitlement. Still defiant. Still sure, somehow, that the institution would catch him like it always had. But this time, the floor had shifted beneath him. At 10:17 a.m., Elijah was called to testify. The room hushed to the point of pressure. He stepped to the front without hesitation. No lawyer at his side, no papers in hand, just a microphone, a chair, and the weight of millions watching through their screens. He sat, looked forward, and spoke. "My name is Elijah Cross. I was slapped in this courtroom without cause, without warning. I did not raise my voice. I did not resist. And I will not let anyone else define what happened to me." That was all. He stood and walked back to his seat. But in those 41 seconds, something elemental cracked open. Because his restraint, his clarity, struck harder than Beckett ever could. It was no longer about proving trauma. It was about naming it in front of those who denied it existed. Then the room began to shift. Spectators, once content to remain observers, started to raise their hands. The judge, a thin man with tired eyes who had hoped this would proceed quietly, was now sweating beneath his collar. "This is not a public forum," he reminded. "Let's remain within protocol." But the people weren't listening to protocol anymore. One woman stood, voice trembling but firm. "3 years ago, I saw that same officer shove my nephew against a wall for laughing in court. We filed a complaint. Nothing happened. Another man, older, his hands shaking, rose from the back. I was told to withdraw my testimony or face charges of contempt. That was Beckett. That's what he does." And so it went, one after another. Testimonies once buried, now blooming in public air. What was meant to be a single hearing had become a public unveiling, a courtroom transformed into a platform for the silenced. And at the center of it all sat Monica Graves, the district attorney who had once weighed her options like stones on a scale. She'd come prepared to oversee the hearing in a supervisory capacity, but she hadn't prepared for this, for the rawness of truth spoken without script, without spin. She had reviewed the files, she had seen the gaps, but hearing the voices filled in something the paperwork never could. These weren't statistics, they were scars, wounds reopened by decades of unchecked power. So when the clerk asked her if the DA's office would proceed with formal defense of Beckett's position, Monica didn't blink. "No," she said into the mic. "The district attorney's office withdraws its defense. We will not stand behind a pattern of conduct that violates the public trust." Gasps echoed across the room. Solomon nodded, just once. Beckett's lawyer stood, objected, demanded recess, demanded protocol. But no one was listening to the old rhythm anymore. A new tempo had taken hold, and it didn't pause for posturing. The hearing continued, now spiraling beyond its original scope. Past cases were cited. Footage, previously unavailable, was played, showing Beckett in various outbursts, slamming a folder onto a desk, yanking a defendant by the arm, whispering threats behind a teenage girl's ear during a juvenile trial. The audio was faint, the image grainy, but the pattern was unmistakable. People watched, not with surprise, but with recognition. By 2:15 p.m., the judge had seen enough. The room wasn't just a courtroom anymore, it was a mirror, and it reflected every layer the institution had tried to conceal. He called a recess, voice cracking under the weight of the shift. As people filed out into the hallway, the reporters followed. Microphones were shoved forward. Questions flew. Did the DA just switch sides? Will Beckett be suspended? Who ordered the footage suppressed? But the only thing the public needed to hear had already been said. By the boy who spoke less than a minute, and by the people who had been silent for far too long. Back inside, Beckett slumped in his chair, eyes darting. The courtroom he'd once dominated now felt like a trap door under his feet. The rules had changed. The room had turned. Because when truth is spoken publicly, silence can't hold the walls up anymore. And the battleground? It had only just been drawn. The rest of the fight would come. But now they knew where to aim. The courtroom was no longer Beckett's territory. What once felt like a stage he could command, posture stiff, badge gleaming, voice sharp, had become a crucible. By the morning after Elijah Cross's testimony, the silence that had protected Deputy Marshal Troy Beckett for over 10 years had begun to collapse under the weight of revelation. And Beckett, once defiant, unshakable, was showing cracks. It started with a tremor in his hands. Small at first, a twitch as he reached for a cup of water during a closed-door session. Then again, as he fumbled with his tie before stepping into a press-adjacent chamber that had once been strictly off-limits to cameras, but now streamed live on local news, watched by hundreds of thousands. His jaw, once locked with smug resolve, was now clenched for containment. He blinked too often. He swallowed before every answer. And he could feel it. He was being watched. But worse, he was being believed about. Because this wasn't just about a slap anymore. By 9 a.m. that Wednesday, footage had leaked. Grainy courtroom security video from 18 months earlier showing Beckett pressing his forearm against the back of a young woman's neck in the holding corridor outside Courtroom 5. No sound. But the image alone, her stunned face, his white-knuckle grip, spread like fire on social media. The source? A local reporter named Daisy Caldwell, working for a small independent outlet out of Macon. Solomon Cross had slipped her just enough breadcrumbs to dig. What she found in court archives and what her editor dared to publish became the spark that turned suspicion into flame. The headline was simple. Repeat offender, the courtroom violence of Deputy Troy Beckett. Within hours, more footage surfaced. A teenage boy shoved during a custody hearing. A public defender muttering, "Beckett's temper again," in a hot mic moment. A series of silent security camera clips, pieced together and time-stamped, that traced a pattern not just of aggression, but of ritual violence, tolerated and ignored by those who should have known better. And now, internal documents began to spill. One by one, Solomon's quiet efforts inside the bureau bore fruit. Through encrypted channels and trusted allies, he'd secured dozens of internal memos, complaint logs, and closed case summaries previously sealed by administrative discretion. It wasn't just Beckett. The documents named 2 judges, including one who had overseen over 60% of Beckett's docket, whose decisions consistently dismissed claims of force as procedurally acceptable. 3 clerks were implicated in routinely failing to log formal complaints using loopholes like incomplete paperwork or delayed notarization as excuses to let them vanish. 6 officers had filed internal concerns about Beckett's conduct, but all were reassigned, and none of those reports were ever formally investigated. It was a chain, each link forged not by truth, but by silence. As these revelations flooded news outlets, the court building transformed. Protesters no longer stood outside. They lined the hallways. Students skipped class. Ministers arrived in collars and robes. Lawyers whispered about contingency plans. And even the judges, some previously untouchable, walked a little more carefully to their chambers. Inside, Beckett sat slumped in a back room, watching the news coverage scroll across a muted screen. Footage of Elijah. Footage of himself. Then a side-by-side comparison. One still, one boiling. His lawyer paced behind him, muttering about damage control. "It's optics. We can survive optics. We'll say it was protocol. You gave a verbal order. He didn't comply." "I never gave a verbal order," Beckett snapped, before realizing how loudly he'd spoken. It was the first honest sentence he'd muttered in days, and he felt its weight immediately. The truth, once spoken, did not retreat. Now the courthouse was surrounded by more than just cameras. It was enclosed by a new moral geometry, a realignment of power. Elijah had lit the fuse with his silence. Solomon had traced the rot. Monica Graves had walked across the courtroom floor and laid her badge at the feet of the people, and Daisy Caldwell had cracked the final seal. Inside, the presiding judge, a woman named Naomi Redding, known for her meticulous legal conservatism, had requested an emergency judicial review. "The scope of evidence demands it," she said from the bench, her voice carrying just enough gravity to signal she had turned. Not fully, but noticeably. Even she had grown tired of being tethered to a sinking institution. Beckett was summoned again to testify under oath. And this time, no one offered to prep him. No support from the sheriff's office. No reassuring nods from the DA's bench. The courtroom watched him walk to the stand alone, for the first time in his career. When asked if he'd ever been involved in physical altercations inside a courtroom setting prior to Elijah Cross, he answered, "I don't recall specifics." When presented with the leaked video footage, his voice shook. That was taken out of context. When asked who authorized the footage's deletion from public record, he looked to the judge and said nothing. It was over. Not by verdict, not by confession, but by evaporation, the slow, visible dissolution of his immunity. And outside, the people weren't just watching anymore. They were naming. Signs waved high. This court belongs to the people. Elijah didn't raise his hand. Beckett did. You hid him for a decade. We found him in a week. By 4 p.m., Judge Redding recessed for deliberation. Beckett exited down the back corridor with no escort. Even the other bailiffs kept their distance. Solomon watched it all unfold from the hallway, eyes unreadable. He had spent 30 years identifying corruption, but rarely did he get to dismantle it in real time. This case had become more than justice for Elijah. It had become a proof of concept. That quiet resistance, when aligned with truth, evidence, and community, could bring down giants. That night, Solomon stood alone in a hotel room, overlooking the courthouse through a 6th-story window. He held in his hand one final file, unsigned, unfiled, unopened until now. It was Beckett's original Academy Psychological Review. Flagged. Borderline unstable. A warning. Ignored. He slipped it into a fresh envelope. Tomorrow, he would deliver it to Congress. Because accountability didn't stop at punishment, it required reconstruction. And Beckett? His armor was gone. All that remained was the truth. And the world watching it unfold. The courtroom was silent when Judge Naomi Redding returned to the bench, her black robe dusted, her face taut with the weight of decision. It was just after 10:30 in the morning, 3 days since the last hearing, and every eye in the room locked onto her with a tension that could snap steel. The nation was watching. Every news outlet had someone inside. Outside the courthouse, nearly 2,000 people stood shoulder to shoulder, their voices hushed in reverent anticipation. This was no longer a local matter. This was a national reckoning. Naomi Redding, 68 years old, had spent nearly 4 decades upholding the rituals and customs of Georgia's judicial system. She had believed in the law as a foundation, as a shield. She'd believed that order, if maintained firmly enough, would produce justice. But now, as she looked down at Deputy Marshal Troy Beckett, shoulders hunched, mouth a tight line, his badge dull on his chest, she realized something terrifying. She had spent her career polishing a mirror that never truly reflected the truth. She cleared her throat. The room held its breath. "For the record," she began, her voice steady but low, "this courtroom has seen more truth in the last 7 days than in some entire years of its history." The words landed like a stone in still water. Judge Redding leaned forward slightly, the gavel at her side untouched. "Mr. Beckett," she said, her gaze hardening, "you have operated in this courtroom with impunity, bolstered by silence, protected by a culture of convenience, and masked by authority. You struck a minor without cause, misrepresented the frequency of your prior altercations, and were the focus of at least 11 suppressed complaints. Each incident, each cover-up, each blind eye cast by those around you amounts to not just professional misconduct, but moral failure." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Beckett flinched for the first time. "You are hereby found in contempt of court and officially guilty of egregious misconduct under state code. You are removed from duty, stripped of badge and title. Further civil and criminal investigations will proceed independently." She paused. Her voice dropped an octave. "But this moment is not just about you." Redding turned her eyes to the crowd. At Monica Graves, who now stood quietly among those she once prosecuted alongside. At the clerks, the officers, the attorneys who'd begun their own silent metamorphosis. And finally, at the Cross family. "Elijah Cross," she said, "you endured in silence what others would have rightly screamed against. You showed the restraint that your elders lacked and the courage this courtroom failed to honor. Let the record reflect. Your dignity has been a light through a very long tunnel." Elijah, still in his school blazer, gave the smallest nod. He hadn't said a word since his testimony. He didn't need to. His silence had already reshaped the room. Then she addressed the man standing beside him. "Mr. Solomon Cross." Solomon rose slowly, one hand on the table, the other at his side. He was dressed in dark navy again, his FBI credentials no longer concealed but also not wielded. There was no smugness, no triumph, just gravity. "You requested to speak," Redding said. "You may proceed." Solomon stepped forward, nodded once to the judge, then turned to face the room, the courtroom, the cameras, and the eyes of a country uncertain whether to exhale or brace again. "When my son was slapped," he began, his voice calm but resonant, "the world assumed that was the first act of violence." He let that sentence hang. It wasn't. It was the last in a long line, a line paved by unchecked power, by people who traded justice for routine. And it wasn't just one man's hand. It was the silence of his colleagues, the blindfold of bureaucracy, the machinery of this courtroom, which has protected everything except the people it serves. A murmur of assent grew in the gallery. "I did not come here seeking revenge," Solomon said. "I came here to hold up a mirror, not just to the system, but to ourselves. Because justice is not a finish line. It's a choice, made again and again, with or without a spotlight." He looked down at his son. Elijah never raised his hand, but his silence said more than any shout. It reminded us that truth doesn't need volume. It needs witnesses. He turned back to Judge Redding. "I submit this to the court," he said, placing a slim, sealed folder on the evidence table. "A full list of known and unknown complaints tied to this courthouse, spanning the last 12 years. It is not exhaustive, but it is the beginning of accountability." Judge Redding reached forward and touched the envelope gently, as if it were something sacred. Solomon stepped back. The judge inhaled slowly and nodded once. "Thank you, Mr. Cross." Then she lifted the gavel. "This court," she said, "recognizes that true justice requires more than law. It requires integrity. Let today mark the start of that pursuit." And then came the sound, sharp, clean, final, the strike of the gavel. But what followed was not chaos. It was something different. The room didn't erupt in anger or clamor. It erupted in resolve. People stood, not to cheer, but to bear witness, to each other, to themselves. Some clapped quietly. Others wept. Reporters wrote furiously, but even they paused to look around and understand what had just occurred. Because the room was no longer just a courtroom. It was a rebirth chamber. Where silence had once protected the powerful, it now fueled change. Where Elijah had once stood alone, dozens now stood with him. Where Solomon had once buried his identity for survival, he now revealed it for justice. Judge Redding didn't leave the bench immediately. She lingered, watching it unfold. The crowd, the emotion, the shift. She felt the tectonic pull of change beneath her. And she whispered to herself, so low no one heard, "Let it never go back." Outside, the crowd began to chant, not in fury, but in unity. One voice, one truth, one justice. And through it all, Elijah and Solomon exited side by side, the doors opening not just to the street, but to the beginning of something neither of them had words for. Not yet. But the world would name it soon enough. The gavel had fallen, but its echo moved far beyond the courtroom walls. In the weeks following Deputy Marshal Troy Beckett's conviction and Judge Naomi Redding's historic rebuke, the courthouse in Jasper County, Georgia, became more than a local government building. It became a symbol of what happens when truth refuses to be silenced, and when silence, used with purpose, becomes louder than any protest. The video clips, the testimony, and the look in Elijah Cross's eyes, unblinking, unwavering, had ignited something bigger than punishment. It had awakened the machinery of reform. Within 10 days, the Georgia State Inspector General's office launched an independent probe into the entire courthouse's operations. Dozens of old records were pulled from storage, some yellowed with time, others redacted so heavily they resembled ink blots more than official documents. The investigation widened quickly. What began with Beckett's misconduct grew into a full-blown examination of how rural court systems often operated in legal shadows, hidden from public oversight, unchecked by outside review. By week 3, the Department of Justice announced its own inquiry, a federal-level investigation into judicial bias, courtroom violence, and racial profiling in low-population counties across the Southeast. What they found was damning. Multiple courthouses where security footage was routinely erased, where complaints from black defendants were reclassified as non-actionable, and where certain officers had logged over 100 physical engagements, none resulting in formal discipline. But it wasn't just about exposure. It was about momentum. And Solomon Cross, who had quietly assembled evidence behind the scenes, used his position in the FBI not to grandstand, but to craft legislation. They called it the Cross Accountability Resolution. At its core, it was simple, but revolutionary. It proposed mandatory body cams for all bailiffs and courtroom officers, with real-time streaming to public oversight boards. Required anti-bias certification for judges, DAs, and court officers every 2 years. A rotating panel of federal monitors assigned to rural courthouses, reviewing conduct and case patterns for racial disparities. Anonymous whistleblower channels for courthouse staff, backed by protection clauses and investigative guarantees. The resolution, co-sponsored by a bipartisan group of senators stunned by the Elijah Cross case, began to move swiftly through the legislative ranks. Hearings were scheduled. Testimonies were prepared. Elijah and Solomon were invited to D.C., not for spectacle, but for substance. But Elijah didn't go right away. He had something more important to do first. On a quiet Monday morning, 1 month after the verdict, Elijah Cross walked back into Washington Carter High School. His return wasn't marked by a banner or applause. There were no photographers waiting. Just a few students clustered near the lockers, whispering as he passed. There was something different about him. It wasn't the headlines or the trial that changed him. It was the burden of having stood still while the world cracked around him, and knowing that his stillness moved mountains. He had walked into court as a boy fighting a charge. He walked out as a symbol no one expected, especially not him. In homeroom, his teacher, Mrs. Kendrick, eyes red from watching every hearing, paused mid-roll call. She didn't say anything, just nodded, and he nodded back. Later that day, Elijah sat in the school library with a guidance counselor he barely knew. The man looked nervous. "If you ever need to talk about, well, anything," he offered, fumbling with a folder. Elijah smiled. "I'm okay," he said. And he meant it. Not because it hadn't hurt, but because he now understood something most grown men never did. That justice doesn't need to roar. It needs to endure. That same day, back in Atlanta, Solomon met with state legislators. He laid out a full map of how disciplinary reports vanished in courthouse bureaucracy. He spoke with precision, but never vengeance. "My son didn't need this fight," he said, "but the system insisted. So now we insist right back." He presented data, charts, case patterns, footage timestamps. He left no room for doubt. And as a result, 10 counties volunteered for early implementation of cross-resolution protocols, long before federal mandates would compel them. Activists across the South organized silent step marches, where participants walked through town centers and courthouse squares in complete silence, holding photos of victims whose complaints had been ignored. Not everyone spoke Elijah's name, but everyone understood what his silence had done. News anchors, usually trained to keep emotional distance, now opened segments with phrases like, "After Elijah Cross," or "Since the Beckett verdict." Editorial boards called the case a moral fulcrum, where the justice system faced itself in the mirror and couldn't look away. Even law enforcement began to shift. Police departments started workshops on non-escalation in high-tension settings. Judges across 3 states called emergency ethics reviews. Courtrooms, once guarded behind glass and ceremony, began to feel human again. But Elijah? He kept showing up. To school, to dinner, to tutoring. He rejoined the debate team but didn't say much. He didn't need to. He had already delivered the most powerful statement a 16-year-old ever could, by standing still in the face of power and not shrinking. And then, one afternoon in early spring, a 6th grader named Amari, wide-eyed and trembling, tapped him on the shoulder during lunch. "Hey," she said, "my brother got stopped by a cop last year. I didn't tell nobody. But after watching you—" She paused. "I'm going to write it down." Elijah looked at her, nodded once, and slid his notebook across the table. "Here," he said, "write it here." Because now he understood. His silence hadn't ended anything. It had opened a door. And he would hold that door open for as long as it took. So when the cameras came calling again, when the invitations poured in from civil rights groups and news shows, he didn't rush. Because justice wasn't just the moment Beckett was sentenced. It was the moment a kid like Amari decided to speak. The ripples had become waves. And Elijah Cross, just 16, just a student, wasn't riding them for glory. He was anchoring them for everyone else. It was late September when they arrived in D.C., the air thick with a kind of expectant calm, like the quiet before a pivotal vote, or the last note of a freedom song that refuses to fade. The Youth Justice Summit filled the Congressional Conference Hall 3 blocks from the Capitol. Inside, nearly 400 high school students from across the country, black, brown, white, indigenous, immigrant, sat shoulder to shoulder in rows of folding chairs that creaked under the weight of hope. The event was built around panels and keynotes, but the buzz in the building wasn't about policy. It was about them. Elijah and Solomon Cross. They didn't enter with press, no handlers or headlines flanking them, just father and son, side by side in quiet navy suits. Elijah, now 17, wore his late grandfather's lapel pin, a tiny silver scale chipped on one side. Solomon wore his bureau badge tucked out of sight, like always, his hands loose at his sides, his posture military but never rigid. It wasn't the suit that made people part as they walked through the crowd. It was the silence. The same silence Elijah had carried through a slap heard around the nation. The same silence Solomon had used to gather names, tapes, testimonies, and truth like firewood for the day it would all burn bright. Now they sat in the front row, no placards, no introductions. The MC didn't need to name them. Everyone knew. The theme of the summit was building tomorrow's justice. The speeches came and went. Youth organizers from Detroit, a 15-year-old council member from Oakland, a Cherokee teen who fought for tribal court recognition in Oklahoma. They spoke powerfully, but they all seemed to orbit one center. The story that lit the fuse. The boy who didn't sit down. Then came the final Q&A session. A long pause. The moderator scanned the room, raised her hand. Anyone have a closing question? A girl in the back stood. Maybe 16? Light brown skin, box braids down her shoulders. Her voice wavered at first. "I had a question," she said, then hesitated. Her eyes found Elijah's. But instead of asking, she lowered the mic to her chest and said just one thing. "Thank you for not sitting down." The room fell silent. She sat. No applause, no echo. Just a stillness that wrapped around them like a prayer finally spoken aloud. Elijah didn't stand, didn't bow, didn't nod. He simply turned to his father, who placed a firm hand on his shoulder. Nothing theatrical, just a gesture thick with everything unspoken. Pride, protection, memory, and the legacy of every silent man before them who never had a room like this to be heard in. Solomon didn't speak either. His face, weathered but composed, seemed to absorb the girl's words like sunlight. They didn't reply. They didn't need to. Because the moment was no longer about them. It was about what they had passed on. Outside the hall, the world still spun in its usual way. Politicians grandstanding, cameras rolling, cynics predicting reform fatigue. But in that room, something different took hold. The crowd didn't cheer. They rose, one by one, quietly. Dozens of young people, from Mississippi to Montana, stood up without prompting, their heads high, not clapping but simply bearing witness. They weren't saluting heroes. They were stepping into the story. Elijah finally rose, not to take a bow, but to walk forward, not alone. The girl who had spoken joined him, then 2 others, then more. They formed a line near the stage, not for pictures, for questions, for organizing, for plans. And Solomon? He stayed back for a moment, watching his son move through a sea of rising voices. There was no script for this, no federal manual for legacy, but he saw it clearly now, the transfer of weight from his shoulders to Elijah's. And the truth was, it didn't look heavy anymore. It looked right. That night, they walked back to their hotel through the soft hum of the city, passing the Lincoln Memorial, the reflecting pool still, moonlight bending across its surface like a second sky. Solomon broke the silence first. "You didn't have to speak," he said. "I know," Elijah replied. "She already did." And that was the heart of it. The beauty of legacy not forged in spotlight, but in echo, in the way justice whispers from one generation to the next, in how a 17-year-old boy, once struck in front of strangers, could now stand in front of a nation, not because he demanded power, but because he embodied restraint with purpose. The cross-accountability resolution, now gaining traction in 11 more states, bore his name. But the work? That belonged to everyone who stood because he didn't sit. Months from now, more students would write letters, more journalists would request interviews, more prosecutors would cite the case as a tipping point. But that night, as Solomon sat in the hotel room armchair, his tie loosened, eyes soft, and Elijah sat cross-legged at the window watching the glow of the Capitol. Neither said a word. They had carried the burden. They had lit the flame. Now it was moving, through courtrooms and classrooms, through policies and prayers. A quiet legacy had begun. And this time, the world wasn't just watching. It was standing. In a country where silence is often mistaken for surrender, the story of Elijah and Solomon Cross reminds us that stillness can be a form of strength, and that justice doesn't always shout. Sometimes it stares back. Sometimes it waits. But when it moves, it reshapes the very system meant to hold it. A 16-year-old boy took a slap in a courtroom. He didn't flinch. He didn't speak. Yet his quiet defiance cracked open decades of institutional silence. And beside him stood his father. Not just a parent, but a senior FBI inspector, armed not with revenge, but with truth. Their story isn't fiction. It's a mirror. And every American who watched, listened, or stood with them now carries a piece of the responsibility to keep pushing forward. We learned that the system can only change when its walls are forced to echo back the voices it tried to erase. We learned that a courtroom can become a battlefield, and a hallway can turn into a pathway for justice. That power must answer to presence. That truth, when carried without fear, moves further than rage ever could. And most of all, we learned that you don't need a podium to speak. Sometimes all it takes is refusing to sit. So what do we do now? We act, we talk, we show up, we vote with conscience, we listen when silence speaks. If you believe in stories that drive change, if you believe in justice as something living, not just written in law but practiced in life, then this is your moment. Subscribe to the channel. Like the video. Share it with 3 people who need to see it. Not next week, not tomorrow, now. Because the story of Elijah and Solomon Cross didn't end in that courtroom. It began in yours. And the next time justice is tested in your town, your school, your courtroom, you'll know exactly what silence can do. Thank you for watching. Now let's get to work.